Power doesn't come quietly. It comes with fire, betrayal, and the weight of choices that change lives forever. In the world of Landman, one man rises from the dirt of the oil fields to the polished table of the corporate boardroom. Tommy's journey in episode 10 isn't just about claiming a title, it's about seizing control of a legacy built on power, greed, and blood. This moment is bigger than any strike of oil. This is the day Tommy becomes the president of MTEX, and nothing in West Texas will ever be the same again. Before Tommy could ever step into the boardroom, the world around him was already burning with tension. MTEX, the oil giant, wasn't just another company, was the beating heart of West Texas wealth and corruption. The season had shown cracks in its walls, leaders fighting for control, families split by greed, and workers caught in the storm. Every move on the oil rigs had ripples in the boardroom. A man who was never supposed to belong in that world. He was a roughneck, a worker who knew the weight of the drilling rigs and the sweat of survival. But his instincts had always been sharper than the men in suits who looked down on him. From the very beginning, Tommy wasn't just surviving the oil game. He was learning it, studying every weakness, every secret, every alliance. By the time episode 10 arrived, Tommy wasn't the same man who walked into this fight at the start of the season. He was harder, smarter, and more dangerous. At this point in the story, MTEX wasn't just dealing with business problems. It was at war with itself. The death of leaders, betrayals within the family, and the endless hunger for power had left the company unstable. Everyone wanted the top seat. Everyone thought they deserved it. But Tommy, the outsider, had a plan no one saw coming. The boardroom became a battlefield long before the official vote. Behind closed doors, whispers of betrayal passed from one shareholder to another. Old loyalties cracked. Promises were broken as fast as they were made. Some believed Tommy was too raw, too reckless to lead. Others, quietly, began to see him as the only man with the guts to take control when the entire empire was. Collapsing the tension wasn't only corporate, it was personal. Tommy's family ties were woven into this chaos, and his choices meant risking the trust of those closest to him. Every word he spoke, every decision he made, pulled him further from his roots and closer to the cold, polished power of the men who had ruled MTEX for decades. This was no longer about oil, it was about survival. As episode 10 opened, the stage was set. A fractured empire, a desperate board, and a man from the oil field standing at the edge of history. Tommy wasn't waiting for permission anymore. He was ready to take the throne of MTEX. The boardroom of MTEX wasn't just a place for business, it was a battlefield dressed in polished wood and glass. Every chair around that long table carried history, influence, and hidden knives waiting to strike. By the time episode 10 begins, those seats are filled with men and women who had built their lives on control, on the idea that power belonged only to the chosen few. To them, Tommy was never meant to sit at that table. He was an outsider, a worker from the rigs, someone who should have stayed beneath the surface of their world. But on this day, every one of them could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming, and Tommy was no longer playing by their rules. The struggle for leadership inside MTEX was nothing new. Factions had formed long before Tommy ever dreamed of power. On one side were the traditionalist old guard executives, who believed the company should stay in the hands of family bloodlines. They argued that legacy mattered more than innovation, that the seat of president was passed down like an heirloom, not earned. On the other side were the opportunist shareholders and leaders who saw MTEX crumbling under outdated leadership. They wanted a new face, someone bold enough to save the company before it collapsed under its own weight. Tommy walked straight into this divide. Somehow, he turned it into his weapon. He wasn't family, but he wasn't an outsider anymore either. He had built relationships in the shadows, gained loyalty from those who had grown tired of empty promises, and whispered just enough truth to the right people at the right time. His rivals underestimated him because they thought he was simpler man of fists, not of strategy. That was their first mistake. Inside the boardroom, voices rose like a storm. Some fought viciously against the idea of Tommy leading MTEX. They called him reckless, dangerous, unfit for the corporate world. They painted him as a man who would destroy the empire out of pride and stubbornness. But others quieter, more calculating, kept their support hidden until the moment mattered most. They knew Tommy's fire was exactly what the company needed to survive. Behind every word, every raised voice, was fear. Fear of losing money. Fear of losing power. Fear of what Tommy represented. Change. Because if a man like him could rise from the dust of the oil fields to sit at the head of the table, then the world these elites had built for themselves wasn't as untouchable as they believed. Tommy wasn't just a candidate. He was a threat to everything they had ever stood for. And yet, even in the chaos, Tommy never wavered. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to beg for votes. He stood steady, letting his silence speak louder than the panic unraveling around him. In that moment, the boardroom wasn't just filled with arguments, it was filled with a shifting balance of power. And everyone in that room could feel it tilting toward Tommy. The power struggle of episode 10 wasn't only about a title, it was about survival. The men and women in that room weren't just fighting for the future of MTEX. They were fighting to protect themselves from a man who had already proven he could outsmart them in the field and in the shadows. And whether they admitted it or not, deep down, they already knew the truth. Tommy wasn't asking for power. He was taking it. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's forged in the fire of struggle, in the moments where a man is forced to choose between who he was and who he must become. For Tommy, the journey from oil-stained roughneck to the polished seat of the MTEX presidency was more than ambition, it was survival. He didn't stumble into power. He clawed his way toward it, step by brutal step, until the man standing in episode 10 barely resembled the worker who once lived and died by the weight of the rigs. At the start of the season, Tommy was defined by grit. His world was built on sweat, labor, and the kind of instincts that couldn't be learned in boardrooms. He knew how to handle men who broke under pressure, how to read the earth when it resisted, how to keep calm when everything around him was ready to collapse. But those instincts, while powerful in the field, were useless in the world of MTEX leadership, or so his enemies thought. What they didn't realize was that those very qualities, the toughness, the sharp eyes, the unshakable resolve, were the exact tools that could tear down their carefully built walls of privilege. As the season unfolded, Tommy began to shift. He learned quickly, not just from allies, but from enemies. Every insult thrown at him became a lesson. Every attempt to undermine him revealed the cracks in the system. Where others saw a man who didn't belong, Tommy saw a map of weaknesses he could exploit. His transformation was not about changing who he was, but about sharpening it, turning raw survival into strategy. But with growth came sacrifice. The more Tommy rose, the more distance formed between him and his roots. Friends who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him on the rigs began to look at him with suspicion. Family questioned his choices, wondering if the hunger for power was consuming the man they once knew. Tommy himself felt the weight of that change. He wasn't blind to what he was losing. He could feel the pull of the boardroom tearing him away from the simple truths of his past life. Still, he pushed forward, because underneath the struggle was a fire that refused to go out. Tommy wasn't chasing power for vanity. He was chasing it because he knew that without it, he would always be at the mercy of men who didn't care about the lives of workers, the people, or even the land itself. His transformation was fueled by a belief that if someone like him didn't rise, then MTEX would remain a machine that chewed up everyone beneath it. By episode 10, the transformation was complete. The man who walked into that boardroom was no longer just a roughneck. He carried the scars of every battle, the lessons of every betrayal, and the unshakable confidence of someone who had faced down giants and lived to tell the story. He wasn't polished like the old guard. He wasn't refined in the ways of their world, but he was something more dangerous, authentic, ruthless, and untouchable in his conviction. Tommy's transformation wasn't about wearing a suit or learning to speak their language. It was about proving that a man who came from nothing could not only stand beside the powerful but surpass them. And as the boardroom prepared to decide the future of MTEX, everyone in that room knew one thing. Tommy wasn't just a contender anymore. He was the storm that was about to rewrite the company's history. The boardroom had never felt so heavy. Every breath, every shift in a chair, Every glance across the polished table carried the weight of what was about to happen. The air was charged, thick with suspicion and fear, but also with something else: anticipation. For years, the presidency of MTEX had been treated like a throne, passed down through loyalty, family, and blood. But on this day, all of that was about to be rewritten. And at the center of it stood Tommy. He didn't walk in with arrogance. He didn't dress himself in the false confidence of the old guard. He carried himself the way he always had, calm, steady, sharpened. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was a fire no one in that room could deny. His presence filled the space, not because of wealth or pedigree, but because everyone knew he had already fought harder, risked more, and survived worse than anyone else seated at that table. The moment came like a storm. The chairman's voice announced the vote, formal and rehearsed. But the tremor beneath his words betrayed the truth. MTEX was on the edge of collapse, and this decision would either save it or destroy it. Hands rose around the table, some confident, others reluctant, a few trembling. Every vote was a betrayal to someone else, every choice a gamble on the future. And through it all, Tommy said nothing. He simply watched, his jaw tight, his eyes cutting across the room like steel. When the count was done, silence that followed was louder than any shouting match that had come before it. The decision was made. The outsider, the roughneck, the man no one thought could even belong in the boardroom, was now president of MTEX. For a moment, no one moved. Some faces hardened in anger, others sank in quiet defeat. Allies tried to hide their relief, knowing the battle wasn't over just because Tommy had won the vote. Enemies stared with daggers in their eyes, already plotting their next moves, already whispering in their minds how they could tear him down. But Tommy didn't look at them. He looked forward, steady, as though this outcome had never been a question in his mind. And then, almost like a shift in the earth itself, the room changed. Tommy wasn't standing among them anymore. He was standing above them. Not because of the title, not because of the seat, but because in that instant, everyone realized he had outplayed them all. The man they mocked for his dirt-stained boots and calloused hands had just taken control of one of the most powerful oil empires in Texas. It wasn't a victory parade. There were no cheers, no applause. The scene was raw, tense, and sharp-edged. But that silence, that heavy, suffocating silence, spoke louder than any celebration could. Because silence in a room full of enemies means only one thing: fear. Tommy didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once, as if to himself, and sat down at the head of the table. It was a simple act, but it carried the force of a hammer striking steel. The crown had been claimed. The throne had been taken. And everyone knew from that moment on, nothing about MTEX or West Texas would ever be the same. The vote had been counted. Now, the title had been claimed, but power never sits quietly. The moment Tommy took the presidency of MTEX, the room fractured into silence, yet beneath that silence, the storm was already gathering. The fallout began the very second he sat down at the head of the table. Some board members lowered their eyes, unwilling to let Tommy see the fury burning in them. They had spent years building their influence, decades ensuring their families would control this empire. And now, a man they dismissed as nothing more than a worker had taken everything they believed was theirs by right. To them, Tommy wasn't a leader. He was an intruder. The air around them was thick with rage, with whispers of betrayal, with the unspoken promise that this fight wasn't over. Others leaned back in their chairs with cautious relief. For them, Tommy's rise was a chance for MTEX to escape the stranglehold of the old guard. It's a chance for survival in a world that was changing faster than the company could keep up. These quiet supporters didn't clap or cheer, but in their silence was something different from anger. It was recognition. They saw in Tommy what the old leaders never had: the ability to adapt, to take risks, to cut through tradition and do what had to be done. But the fallout didn't stop at the boardroom doors. Word traveled quickly, seeping through the halls of MTEX like oil through cracked soil. Workers in the field, men and women who had known Tommy as one of their own, felt the news like a shockwave. For them, it was almost impossible to believe. There's a man who had walked the rigs, eaten the same dirt, faced the same danger, was now sitting at the very top. Some celebrated, convinced that Tommy's leadership meant someone would finally care about the people on the ground. It's not just the men in suits. Others doubted him, whispering that power would change him, that no man could rise that high without forgetting where he came from. The reactions reached Tommy's personal circle, too. Family, friends, and rivals alike stared at the new reality with mixed emotions. For some, it was pride. For others, fear, because they knew the cost of power in West Texas. They knew that wearing the crown of M-Tex meant becoming a target. Tommy's victory didn't just make him president, it made him the center of every grudge. Every plot, every buried ambition waiting to explode. And then there was Tommy himself. Sitting in that chair, feeling the weight of the title pressed against his shoulders, he knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. He had won the boardroom, but winning the boardroom wasn't the same as controlling it. Every eye in that room told him the same thing. They would test him, they would push him, they would tear him down the moment he slipped. But Tommy wasn't built to slip. He wasn't built to bow. His face didn't show celebration. It showed resolve. The same resolve that carried him through the rigs, through betrayals, through every fire that tried to consume him. And now, sitting at the head of MTECs, he carried that same fire with him. The fallout of his victory wasn't applause or unity. It was tension, sharp and dangerous, like a string pulled too tight. The boardroom, the company, and even his own circle now revolved around one undeniable truth. Tommy had taken the throne. And the question wasn't whether he could hold it too, was how many enemies he would make before the throne tried to crush him. Every rise to power casts a shadow, and Tommy's victory was no different. Becoming president of M-Tex wasn't the final step of his journey. It was the first step into a battlefield more dangerous than the oil rigs. It's more treacherous than the boardroom vote. With the throne claimed, the future stretched before him like an open desert tendless. It's unforgiving and filled with storms waiting on the horizon. The first shadow lay in the enemies he had just created. Men and women who had spent years building their control over M-Tex weren't going to simply fade away because the vote didn't fall in their favor. No, these were people who thrived on revenge, who built empires on secrets, who knew how to strike from the dark when their opponent least expected it. They didn't see Tommy as their president. They saw him as a mistake that needed correcting in every quiet glance. Every whispered word as they left the boardroom promised the same thing. They would come for him. But Tommy's battles wouldn't just be fought against the old guard. The world outside M-Tex was shifting. Oil prices, global investors, environmental battles, forces bigger than Texas itself were pressing against the company. And now, every choice, every misstep would fall on Tommy's shoulders. If he faltered, M-Tex wouldn't just stumble, it would collapse. The weight of an empire that had crushed men stronger than him now rested squarely on his back. Then came the personal cost. Power had already begun to carve lines through his relationships, and that divide would only deepen. Friends who once trusted him now questioned whether he'd sold himself to the very system he once fought against. Family looked at him with both pride and fear, unsure if the man they loved was still there beneath the crown. The more Tommy held on to power, the more he risked losing everything else. And yet, in all this uncertainty, one truth remained. Tommy was not a man to back down. If anything, the threats only fueled him. The whispers of betrayal, the looming challenges, the storms gathering in the distance, they weren't deterrents. They were invitations. For every enemy planning to tear him down, Tommy was already preparing his counterstrike. The future of M-Tex wasn't secure, it was volatile and on the edge of chaos. But that was exactly the kind of world Tommy thrived in. Because unlike the polished men who had ruled before him, Tommy wasn't afraid of the fight. He welcomed it. He knew that in the oil fields, in the boardroom, in life itself, survival belonged to the ones willing to get their hands dirty. So as the curtain closed on Season 1, the question wasn't if Tommy could hold on to the presidency. The real question was, how much blood, betrayal, and sacrifice would it take to keep it? And when the storm finally hit, Would he still recognize the man he had become? More would the throne of Mtex consume him like it had consumed so many before?